What's up, everybody? Back at it. Got some fun news to share, some interesting information from all my recent studies. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Good last day of August 31st, 8:24 p.m. Eastern. We got a beautiful waxing crescent moon. 21% right now, 21.4. And yeah, a bit of a hazy sky, but the image is looking real sharp at the Terminator. We got Mare Nectaris and Mare Tranquillitatis getting cut by the Terminator, Crisium Fecunditatis, and then yeah, so I'm gonna let some music play, let our space fam trickle in, but as you can tell from the thumbnail, I want to talk about this thing called Stellar Metamorphosis theory tonight, among other things. And really fascinating idea put forth by a couple of gentlemen, a guy named Jeffrey Walensky and another guy named Daniel Archer, and I think they have another guy named Baz or something, I forget the last name, but working on the graphics. It's absolutely unknown channel, and yeah, talk about it a bunch more. Really incredible idea about, in the simplest terms, stars basically turning into planets, turning into moons, asteroids, and then the cycle returning. So, because I hate baiting people into just wait till you hear what the idea is. Very simply, yeah, it's just like we think now about planets being separate, stars being separate things, stars exploding or disappearing, and planets potentially forming as accretion disks. But this idea of stellar metamorphosis is things start as Markland Convection, start as giant stars, and ultimately whittle down all the way from giant gas giants to water planets to Earth to Mars to Venus to moons, asteroids. It's kind of amazing, and really super, underground on YouTube. Has almost no channel followers and very few comments, but I found a tie-in to the Demystify Science podcast, and this guy, Jeffrey Walensky, does reference Sky Scholar, like Pierre Marie Robitaille. So it's going to be fun. I see Debbie Carson in the chat and Roach Steve, what's going on? So yeah, that's a little bit of a preview, and play some music here, get myself a drink prepared, and let our fam come through. Alright. Still working up the intro here, but just to keep the show moving, say what's up here to Esoteric Gold and Bryce Eshelman. What's happening? So yeah, I'll post it throughout the night, but I'm going to quickly link the Jeffrey Walensky channel. Right now he's got 738 subscribers. Let's see if we can make a little dent in it. I know this channel is not so big necessarily, but this guy has like literally no subscribers. So let's... Now, I spent a while studying. I've watched maybe 30, 40, 50 of his videos at this point about stellar evolution, stellar metamorphosis rather. And he talks a lot about a bunch of different theories, some about how the culture around introducing new ideas and the stigma, the same sort of stuff that we've seen in the electric universe, and just new concepts, and how there's this dogmatic wall or gatekeeping of new ideas. He also talks about ufology and certain things that I might not agree with 100%, but overall he seems like a really intelligent guy, super nice, and just very endearing and sincere. And this idea of stellar metamorphosis is, I think, kind of pretty genius. It's like this huge piece of the puzzle. I'm just going to link the direct video. Baz Taylor is the guy, I think, who's doing the graphics here. So 738 subscribers. Hopefully we can get him like maybe 10, 20 more, maybe more, if you like his content. But absolutely worth at least just seeing what he has to say and giving light. So this is the video. It's called Planetary Evolution, A Message to Neil Adams. And it's just the most concise version of the idea, where the graphics are there and it just shows this interesting idea of that kind of brings in electric universe, but actually, alright, let me see how I can explain this. It brings in electric universe ideas of Markland Convection and plasmoids and Z-pinches in terms of the birth of stars, but it completely kind of changes up the way we might imagine planets forming, because right now in the electric universe is kind of idea that potentially planets are spat out by gas giants, like the moon or Earth being spat out of Jupiter, or being split apart from Jupiter. And then in the standard cosmological model we have accretion disk formation of planets, where you have the rings of small debris fusing together to create planetary bodies and moons. So his idea here, and I think it's his, but also it could be him and Daniel Archer and other people who might have suggested this, but he's had a channel for over 10 years. And it's just an amazing thing that I stumbled across this. I think I was just looking up Markland Convection. The simple understanding of Markland Convection is just crossing two wires and creating a spark between them. So imagine you cross two wires and it creates a spark, and this spark ends up being the beginnings of a star, and it's spinning really quickly, and these are the white giant stars that we have. And then over time it actually starts to slow down in terms of angular momentum, in terms of spin, and it also starts losing its atmosphere. But within the star, this giant atmosphere, all the conditions for what we consider life, and the atmospheric conditions for gigantism, and the formation of oceans happen all within this star atmosphere. And then ultimately things become water planets, like water worlds, like Uranus, Neptune, and this is after their... So if you really imagine it, so Jupiter ends up turning into something like Saturn, for example, and then Saturn loses the ring, and then Saturn ends up turning into something like Uranus or Neptune. Neptune ends up turning into something like Earth. So Earth is this kind of state where it's lost tons of atmosphere, but essentially Earth was a star. And this is what he's proposing. So Earth was formed inside a star, and that's where we get life from being our DNA and the actual core of all life being fused inside the core of a star, and then as the star's atmosphere dissipated and the spin neutralized, Earth ends up having a particular type of condition where life, like people, can people on the surface of Earth and exist on what is a mix of oceans and land masses that were formed at the nucleus of a star. I'm going to explain it a bunch of different ways. I'm still digesting it myself, but I do love the idea of this. And then, ultimately, Earth, after all the volcanism is dead and the angular momentum is lessened and our atmosphere is completely gone, we turn into something like a Venus or Mars, where the atmosphere is stripped, magnetic field is reduced, and it's actually just really not hospitable to human condition, to life. And then if you imagine that can keep going and keep slowing down and keep getting stripped apart, you end up with things like Venus, Mercury, and these essentially steel balls at the end of it. Nickel, lead, iron, and that's why Mercury barely spins. That's why the moon, for example, is, if you imagine the moon in this circumstance, in this idea, the moon is actually way older than Earth. It's actually an old Earth. And so you start to think about this, you're like, wait, potentially this is why the surface of the moon looks like continents and oceans. Maybe it's a very desiccated, extremely old Earth. And ultimately, by that logic, you infer that it was also a star at one point. So the moon and the Earth potentially could have been stars at one point, and ultimately the Earth might end up looking like the moon. And then where he goes with the theory is that the moon, continues to desiccate until it's whittled down into debris, and then the debris gets eaten up by the larger stars and recycled. And so it's a very holistic theory as well. CGED Skeptic Media, hey, it's happening. So, really brilliant. I mean, it explains spin of planets, it explains formation of planets from a really logical standpoint, even though it really completely changes the ages of things, and it also changes, it flies in the face of contemporary planet formation. But I really was blown away by this idea. It also fits very nicely within the electromagnetic, plasma universe, field cosmology. And he explains a lot of other things about like gigantism in terms of, like Thunderbolts Project has talked about this, but how dinosaurs and gigantism on Earth may have existed. And he talks about how the atmosphere must have been very different in primitive Earth, and therefore certain types of conditions would allow life forms like dinosaurs to exist. Potentially dinosaurs being aquatic creatures and having less of a differential between the air and the water. I'm not very good with things like volumes and stuff like that, but he explains it really well. Anyway, that's a little bit about planetary evolution or stellar metamorphosis theory. But what I'm very excited to share it because it is like one of those pieces of the puzzle that not many people have seen or discovered or talk about. I've really dug in pretty deeply over the last couple of weeks, just trying to learn about what he's talking about. And then I also found that he references the Demystify Science podcast, which is the couple that's doing all the interviews. They just did an interview with Gerald Pollack on Easy Water and other things. They interviewed Halton Arp, Wal Thornhill. Imagine. The ghost of Halton Arp. Shockwave, I am a primitive man. Shockwave, have you heard of this cat, Jeffrey Walensky? I dare I say you'd find it deeply fascinating, and just full of little juicy tidbits about our cosmos. But it does actually kind of change some facts in terms of what we consider, the stories of Kronos, the stories of Saturn and Jupiter or Uranus. I was just watching electric universe eyes talk about some, what was it? It was maybe a letter to Velikovsky or some summary of the last 6,000 to 9,000 years in terms of depositing oceans and stuff like that. But I start to think about it like, if you do apply this stellar metamorphosis idea to electric universe in the way we understand it, can we fill in some of the holes? What other ideas? He was talking about how diamonds are deposited, ammonia rain inside the atmosphere of a star, and also he talked about how essentially life arose on Earth. It wasn't really started from one point. It just came to being as an evolutionary stage or phase or modality or frequency of our ether plasma. I mean, he does touch upon this stuff. He definitely is aware of Thunderbolts. He references Sky Scholar and Pierre-Marie Robitaille. He has had a conversation in the chat with Demystify Science podcast, but I feel like he's kind of off on this own island and really nobody's checked out his stuff. So that's a little bit about Jeffrey. Super cool. I mean, I don't agree with absolutely everything he was saying, especially the kind of point where, let's say, you get to Moon or Mercury, and then he's like, the Moon and Mercury collide or get impacted and create asteroids. That's where I still feel like potentially you have cosmic thunderbolts or lightning bolts that interact when things get close. That's what actually zaps out and breaks off stratified rock or asteroids. He does actually reaffirm a great concept, which is the fact that asteroids and comets are the same thing, where asteroids have more of a circular orbit, but comets have more of an elliptical orbit, like a much steeper elliptical orbit, and therefore they gain that kind of angular momentum that creates the coma. But essentially it's the same exact debris that is an asteroid, as a comet, as a meteor. So very holistic. I love ideas like that that really fill in the gaps. So anything I can do to bring a little bit of light to his ideas. And also what I discovered from that is this repository of information called Vixra, vixra.org. Let me just double check that. Is it vixra.org? It is. So this, while very, speaking of primitive, is quite primitive, but this has a ton of incredible information, papers submitted by professors, but also independent scientists and just theorists, and you can just really, I dug in a little bit, but there's a ton. Don't let the interface scare you. So how's everyone doing tonight? It's going to be a show as long as it doesn't rain. I'm going to keep with it. We got a 24% waxing Crescent Moon. We can zoom in on the South Pole. It's the tip of the bottom left corner-ish. We can look there. And then, of course, I was keeping an eye on the Artemis mission, which got scrubbed. I'm keeping an open mind about that. You all know I have a healthy amount of skepticism, but I do want us to go to the moon, regardless of whether we did it or not. And if we did it, great. And if we didn't, I'm kind of done at this point. It would be amazing to just see a public space mission to the moon succeed. All right, hit me up with some comments in the chat. Hope everybody's doing well. And let me know if you, what you think of this stellar metamorphosis idea, and how it's just like completely like makes. But I also love the fact that it starts with Markland Convection, which is basically a Z-pinch created by two crossing Birkeland filaments. So just you cross the wires or cross the streams, and you create a node, tension, at tension, and that giant white dwarf, or white, what is it? Not white dwarf. White giant, is that what it's called? blue giants, smaller blue stars, white stars, yellow suns. Right, the sun too. Basically our sun. So yeah, this is one point that I meant to make, which is in this idea, if you really consider it, it means that things are very different ages. And so the Earth is way older than the sun, and the moon is way, way, way older than the Earth. And that's something to chew on, because we've never really considered those ideas before. And similarly, the idea that the moon had continents and oceans, and it became it's basically the moon is a desiccated Earth, is a really cool idea. It kind of changes a lot in terms of how we might consider the moon being this, being almost a lesser body versus having been, you know, a star and an Earth, and now we're looking at the moon being a dead Earth that's essentially drying up and it's a bone. It's been calcified, and that's kind of crazy. Which also, like, you know, because you all know that I talk about thunderbolts or electric arcing creating surface features, but potentially, if you think about this idea that the moon was an Earth, this could be a volcanic thing, much more so than an electrical arcing thing, even though that's still on the table. I think it's a combo of all of it, right? You have small impacts, you have giant electrical connections and reconnections, so you have a lot of arcing and sinuous rills, but then potentially this is, you know, the moon was an Earth at one point. So, lot to think about. For me, it's one of the coolest things I've heard in a long time. I got that feeling that I got when I first found Thunderbolts Project, and I saw symbols of an ancient sky. Is it symbols of an alien sky? And you see all the symbols making up these plasma formations, and you're like, damn, that's incredible. And so when I saw this planetary evolution video, I had the same kind of feeling, like, wow, nut has been cracked to a degree. Alright, let me know what you think. And I'll play some Light of the Moon here. Check out some Earth Shine as well. Back on it.
I was in
yo, yo. I see Patrick McNellis in the chat. What's going on, old friend? Nice to see you. Yeah, so I was just trying to adjust it a little bit. It got pretty hazy quickly. So I'm not sure we're going to get this earth shine like I want, but still, definitely the light of the moon going through. Roach Steve says, definitely with you on the arcing stuff, but he seems a little out there. I assume you're referring to Jeffrey Walensky, unless, or maybe you, or do you mean me? I think I'm a little out there too. But, yeah, he seems a little strange to start, and then you start really relating to his manner of speaking, and I think he's just figuring it out, like, but I think he also has a sense of sincerity because there's excitement in his voice. He really wants to share this idea, and those are the best types of ideas that get you thinking. Mary, long time, butterfly princess, queen of the butterflies. I hope you're doing well. It's been a long time. Yeah, Jeff. So yeah, give him a chance. Really, like, now I'm kind of really vibing with his videos. Again, there are certain things that I've been noticing in a lot of different videos that have been bugging me. I'll whine just a tiny bit about it, which is like this idea that people are trying to... Okay, let me see which specific thing. So he talks about how both modern science and electric universe are wrong. He has a title of his video that's like that. And I'm like, when you really listen to the video, he's really not saying that. He's saying that the one part of the idea of basically planetary formation, which is true. On Thunderbolts Project, when you listen to Walt Thornhill and them talk about planetary formation, they are not really certain. But I don't like those kind of clickbaity titles, even though he has no followers. It's like, it's kind of weird to make these kind of sweeping assumptions about electric universe, quote unquote. Same thing, I noticed some people in his... let me adjust the moon a little bit. I feel like I want to see some more detail. Yeah, too hazy. Too hazy for earth shine. But we'll just see our crescent. Yeah, he also... Yeah, so there are things that Jeffrey talks about that I'm not in 100% agreement. I was going to talk about Theoria Apophysis, Ken Wheeler. Everybody's got their own opinion of Ken, but Ken's been putting out amazing videos recently, and but he also has just some certain ideas about people and personalities and other things, and so he judges people quite harshly. I think it's from a standpoint of feeling insecure, but it also kind of sullies some of the science for me. Although what he's saying is really, he just had a video today about the holographic etheric model, and everything he says in that video in terms of physics, in terms of science, just really resonates with me. But just in terms of judging people for... I think what he was missing from today's idea is that he's always like, but people are too stupid to understand this. And I think that's just like a weird way to present concepts, to assume that just because some people don't grasp concepts, that pretty much all of us kind of stink. At the core, you know, we all kind of suck. And I just hate that kind of premise or that presumption, especially when he's talking about these concepts, and whoever's listening to him is there to really learn. So I just don't understand in couching brilliant concepts with character assassination or judgment of others, especially when anyone could judge them back. I feel the same way a bit about Jeffrey Walensky and Daniel Archer in the comments. Somebody was talking about microdosing, and they gave them a hard time. They're like, no one who's ever taken any substance has said anything wise, or some to the effect of that. So it's basically judging usage of psilocybin. I'm just like, there's no need to say these types of sweeping judgments of people. A lot of people just do what they want to do. So don't, refrain from judging. That being said, scientifically, plasma cosmology, field ideas, Ken Wheeler's been killing it. See the pattern. Gareth Samuel has been doing like such a killer job. Like, he's so many different videos that I missed, and so I've been catching up on that. So his stuff is amazing. He's talking about Markland Convection. He's talking about electrical arcing. Yeah, so I know I'm all over the place. Lately I feel like I'm all over the place because there's just a ton of information that's happening right now. We're in the midst of things evolving and changing. AI is on the rise, lots of new ideas. The amount of concepts on YouTube right now, and this thing I found Vixra and all these different places, you can really put together some pretty high-level thinking. That's how I feel like I've been deep in study lately. Yeah, Patrick, it pushes people away. I mean, I don't know. I just kind of wince a little bit. I'm like, wait, why are you judging people for doing that? Especially people who are listening to you. They're not dummies. They're there, right? The dummies are the people not listening to you. So what's the point of calling them out? Anyway, I wanted people to check out the Jeffrey Walensky stuff with an open mind. You might completely disagree and think like he's a nut, but for me it's a massive piece of the puzzle. One of the last holistic, well, I don't want to say the last because there'll be a ton more, but one of the big pieces of the electric universe idea can be solved with this idea, this holistic stars becoming planets, becoming moons, becoming asteroids, being reabsorbed into stars, and holistically turning around. Recycling the system, and that's where planets come from. They used to be stars. Not every star becomes a habitable planet, but pretty much it explains all the processes, all the angular momentum shifts. It explains the arrangement of planets in our solar system. And it gives us a new device to derive and to contrast some of the ideas from the plasma universe or the holographic field universe or anything that we've been discussing, that I've discussed on the channel. Whichever one you call it, it's pretty much the same idea that we're all connected by electrical filaments. These electrical filaments are really light in an ether. The ether is pure potential consciousness, and resonance in this ether creates these luminous plasma filaments. The filaments cross wires, they create stars, and this is the same process that creates stars is the same process of us creating vibrations by speaking. It's the same interaction between people, it creates sparks, giving birth, and on and on. It's a fractal process. So Bryce is saying, middle of the quasar, where does the material come from? It's shooting out. Maybe on the other side it's a black hole that's sucking planets in and then shooting them out the other side, a blender. I think it's a little bit like if you imagine the human body being a stack of toruses, but we're really a tube. We take in food and expel it, and we take in ideas and expel those. So the idea of a vacuum or a black hole, so to speak, or a tube that sucks in matter and spits it out is essentially completely consistent with the idea of a worm, or what humans are, pretty much a very complex set of tubes. So yeah, I think it's more fascinating. Well, not more fascinating, but I think it actually starts opening up ideas if you think about the age of things, right? And how we measure things. What else did I want to talk about? I've been following along with Alexander Unziker's channel, Real Physics. So let me link Jeffrey again, and also, if you missed it, Mr. Walensky and Real Physics Unziker. So this cat, the Machian, this cat is amazing. Again, he's, still figuring out a lot. No real answers here, but just his breakdown of all the concepts and just really drilling them over and over, you start really grasping a little bit of what Maxwell was talking about, what Planck was talking about, what Dirac was talking about. So I've watched his videos now like 5-6 times a piece, and just by virtue of repetition, you start to grasp some of these ideas, the math behind the physics, how he breaks them apart, and then also a big thing that he's been championing is Einstein's original idea of the variable speed of light, which in and of itself is a whole deep dive. And in simple terms, it's essentially that light, if you imagine as light moves away from you, it actually slows down. And so closer to you, light is faster, and further away, light is slower, but it's also fractal at every scale. So at every scale, there's a light speed, at least as far as the way I look at it. Now, granted, some people don't completely believe that, but if you imagine that fractally everything is completely conscious in a certain way, the same way that you have people having a full set of capacity consciousness but then end up doing certain roles. Proteins in our body have full set of conscious capacity but end up performing roles. And hydrogen atoms do the same thing. Self-organization, self-awareness. And then at the very cosmic scale, our universe is likely self-assembling and self-aware and doing its own version of role play. So, Unzicker and Jeffrey Walensky, of course Eileen McCusick. Let me just link all of these, why not? I love to see all these channels actually gain viewership and subscribers, so Eileen and one more, Rupert Sheldrake, because old Roops is getting old, but he's still around, so you can give him some love. Talk about the morphogenic field. There you go. What up, Red Rum? Good to see you. Finally, you can be here for one. So yeah, if you missed what I was saying, I'm going to repeat it a bunch, but also jump back to the beginning. Show tonight about stellar metamorphosis theory, championed by Jeffrey Walensky and Daniel Archer. And yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on it, and definitely check out the links that I sent. Walensky, the Machian, Alexander Unzicker, Eileen Cusick, and Rupert Sheldrake, among others. Let's go to some tunes. Old school here. Right. So let's go through this again. I know it's going to be a bit of a repetitive show, but that's what I really need to figure out, how to propose some of these ideas without going off on like a million tangents every single time. It's great to see you, Red Rum, and all my friends, old and new. If you're lurking, say what's up. It's safe. So yeah, the moon is very quickly setting. So I think as long as it's clear, I'm going to stay streaming. But the show tonight is about stellar metamorphosis theory. You can see it in the thumbnail. Let me see if I can just pull up this image real quick and I can talk about it a bit more. But yeah, in very simple terms, this cat named Jeffrey Walensky, and I think his friend Daniel Archer, or they might have just met via talking about the same thing, propose, and this is not new, this is about 10 years old. He's at this channel for a long time. I've linked it. But he talks about the idea that wires, or Birkeland currents in space, cross wires by Markland Convection, or Markland currents. And essentially that spark that the ropes, the Birkeland filaments, the electrical currents in space, but basically crossing wires, create a spark. That spark becomes a giant star. It ends up cooling and turning from a blue star to a red star to a yellow star, ultimately cooling and slowing down its spin, losing atmosphere, eventually turning it into more of like a water world, turning into kind of a brown dwarf like Jupiter, and then ultimately turning into Saturn. So potentially something like Jupiter would ultimately lose its outer atmosphere that would collapse into a ring, and that's what Saturn is. And then Saturn will eventually lose its ring due to atmosphere, the solar wind and radiation, and essentially just aging. So Saturn would age and ultimately turn into a water world like Uranus or Neptune, so just swirling oceans, but much smaller, much slower angular momentum, so spin. And then over time, these water worlds like Uranus and Neptune turn into things like Earth. So the core of the star, after all this change, has actually formed a core that we actually have, this nickel iron molten core, but it happened from condensing matter. So our orange star, if you see the surface of it, like Pierre-Marie Robitaille talks about, this condensed matter star, is essentially liquid metal, or liquid rock, really. So plasma rock. And then essentially Earth has a molten core, but it's much smaller. We're actually living on the surface of the inner core of the star. And so ultimately Earth will lose all its volcanic activity and reduce its spin. And over lots of years, I mean, his timescale stuff is also interesting, and I'm not, 100% about that either, but just the idea that Earth ends up becoming the moon. And then if you look at the moon, that's just absolutely incredible, because it starts to give you a bit of context for some of these formations on the moon, that maybe the moon was once an Earth, which is just another idea, right? It doesn't have to be true or false right now. It's just a completely cool, interesting idea. It also proposes that the moon is way older than the Earth in terms of, like, let's say, billions of years. And that ultimately the Earth will end up looking like the moon, which is also a cool idea. Excuse me. Astralis, what's going on? Long damn day, big energy wave. Yeah, what's behind the moons? Yeah, what's behind the moons? Probably an electrical magneto field of some sort that is elongated away from Earth. Plain Truth Lurkin, what's going on? I see ya. So yeah, so give this cat, I keep saying cat, this guy, Jeff Walensky, a chance. Just watch a couple of the videos. It's not polished at all, right? And he's got a whole thing, but I think it's just so undiscovered. It's like a total gem. I wouldn't recommend it if I didn't think it was an incredible piece. And if nothing else, I've mentioned the theory here on this video right now. All any smart person needs to hear is, oh, what if stars didn't form, what if stars didn't form by accident and explode? And also, what if planets didn't form in an accretion disk? What's an alternative idea to that? And this idea of stellar metamorphosis, is a very really beautiful, holistic, simple idea of the fact that everything at some point was a star, and stars evolve into planets, moons, asteroids, comets, and ultimately debris. And then the debris falls back into stars that gobble it up and kind of recycle the material. And so space is a holistic, self-consuming system in a way. Almost, just like we feel like we're part of Earth and we eat off the land and there's a circular system to it and it feels very holistic. Right now, if you look up mainstream planetary formation or mainstream star birth, this idea that stars are completely different things than planets, it's actually quite disjointed, and it feels a little bit like that difference between standard cosmology and electric universe ideas. Here's another one, planetary formation. Now, in the stellar metamorphosis concept is really brilliant, because essentially Earths are born inside a giant atmosphere that's a star, and over time, like a top, it loses its spin and it loses its atmosphere because atmosphere dissipates into space. You end up getting planets that are baked at really high temperatures and then ultimately form their own oceans. And that's why we have things like Uranus, Neptune, we have Jupiters, we have Saturns, and we can see planets in all their different life stages. It's like having old people, young people, and babies, and on in the same reality. This is such a beautifully holistic fractal idea. Yeah, let me know what you think of that. That's what I've been wanting to say for like 10 days now. I've been studying it every night, every day, just watching these videos on top of what I was also talking about, Alexander Unziker breaking down the Riemannian tensor and Dirac's long number theory and fucking the Schwarzschild radius and 2gm over r squared. And so the other night I just got so delirious from the amount of info that I was taking in that I just started mouthing off all these theories, just these concepts, and now like I can't think of any more but those. What is it, the event horizon, the Schwarzschild radius, these are all black hole concepts. So anyway, if we go back a little bit, talking about black holes, talking about holographic universe stuff, this crossover is actually really interesting. There's an amount of data right now where physics, even mainstream physics, is actually entertaining the idea that, it's piecemeal, but they're entertaining the idea that, okay, maybe black holes are not exactly what they are, and maybe the Big Bang didn't happen. And so the culture on YouTube has changed, I gotta say, even though you do have these mainstay gatekeepers that have millions of followers and hundreds of thousands of likes, and it's just like complete mainstream dogma gatekeeping. Typical type of shit, but that's how it is. Having somebody like Unziker break down physics and having Rupert Sheldrake have his YouTube channel, just amazing that we have that. You know how Einstein felt, so smart it'll drive you mad. I don't know, like, I've come full circle on Einstein, right? Like, you get into conspiracy circles and you're like, damn, Einstein, what a fool, what a blah blah blah. Like, I don't think he was the nicest person ultimately, if you read some of the stuff about him, just in terms of his prejudices. However, when you see some of the variable speed of light and the stuff he was questioning later in life, you realize that his information, or whatever he became famous on, the platform he became famous on, was very cherry-picked and very intentionally, the stuff that he was talking about earlier was obscured, and then they just took this idea of the speed of light being consistent throughout the universe, and this idea that we had a Big Bang, this something from nothing, and this jived really well with a religious concept, the fiat lux idea that, the touch of God created our universe, and then religion took over, and now we kind of live in a religious scientific system. And the more I see it, the more I realize, as the years go on, you start to realize that that's really what people think. They're so tied to these ideas, and it's very hard to entertain new ones, especially when it's a belief system like that and it's emotional. But science should kind of give you the tools to understand emotion and reality better, as opposed to using emotional tools to oppress people and to gatekeep information. But yeah, I was just being really ridiculous the other day, but it's very interesting to brute force, just over and over and over, watch videos about all these mathematical formulas, like I was saying, Dirac's large number theory, and this idea of fine-tuning. You start to fine-tuning constant. You start to realize that all these mathematicians and theorists over the years had tons of assumptions. And I think a big part of why we are where we are in contemporary cosmology is based on false assumptions rather than even the proofs at the very end of it. This idea that light should have a speed limit or even a speed is something somebody decided to think about, and that assumption led down a path of discovery and counter-discovery and so on. But when you really consider it, like, what's the point? What is... You could just as easily say, I'm going to study the speed of water or the speed of atoms. So those assumptions, coupled with celebrity and religion, end up becoming the dominant science structure we have today. But not to whine about it, actually more so to point out that even on YouTube, a completely controlled platform, you have people talking about really interesting, brilliant ideas, although they were really buried. So this Jeffrey Walensky, case in point, totally buried channel, although I feel like little connections can be made, and so I'm resonating right now. I'm creating an oscillation that is just encouraging people to check out his channel and the idea and try and see if it does something for you. And you don't have to believe it if you don't want to, but I definitely think it's worth spending a few minutes on. Let's see. Red Rum saying, I don't know about that because you can't share religious beliefs and science beliefs because they counteract each other. Well, I think the idea of intelligent design is just so complicated and loaded. It's really difficult to even talk about it without outlining what, each person's perspective on what they think it really means. But ultimately, when you look at nested hexagons or honeycomb or all these different structures we see in nature, the nested hexagons of molecules, of atoms, of craters on the moon, you start to see organization, and you start to wonder why hexagons exist. For me, that's what I started to wonder. And then you put together these theories and you start to realize, you're like, no, at every scale these hexagons nest. There is this point, trying to find the point of least vibration or the strongest formation. So the universe self-assembles. And so if you take that further, the fact that the universe self-assembles means that every single thing that assembles is spatially aware of its radius. So another big idea that I've stumbled across about the universe, which is looking into Markland Convection. If you look into Markland Convection, which in simple terms is, imagine an old analog telephone coil, those coiled cables. So an electrical version of that is what you could imagine as like an electrical Birkeland filament winding up and becoming more and more, and having more and more torsion, tautness, tightening, and springiness as well. So you're almost creating a spring. And this spiraling, this coaxial spiraling, is really how DNA is formed. It's the fractal version of DNA, but on a cosmic scale, it actually, and human scale, it outlines, it runs through our entire body, it runs through the entire Earth, it runs through the solar system, and it's this fractal recursion of a torsion electrical filament. And I was trying to make a point that I completely lost talking about that, but yeah, Donald Yates, I see you in the chat. Can you share the names in the comments of this video so we can watch these channels? Absolutely. I'm working on all of it, but I will put these links in the comment after the video, for sure. Jeffrey Walensky, Alexander Unziker, those two I've been really deep diving into, but the connection, there is the connection to the whole Demystify Science podcast as well. I don't know if y'all have checked that out, but they've gotten some really amazing interviews. I feel like there should be even more crossover, like Unziker should be talking to Robitaille regularly, and Eileen McCusick should be talking to Gerald Pollack, and I think there should be way more crossover. I feel like I want to do it, but I understand it's like a ton of work and to reach out and to organize it. So I haven't figured that out yet, but potentially. So our moon is dimming. This is just because it's setting already, early night, 9:23 right now. But I'm just loaded up with a ton of data. I mean, especially this Stellar Metamorphosis thing really filled in a ton of gaps for me and gave me a much broader sense of the holographic, luminous, etheric universe, the connected universe. It's starting to feel ridiculous to even say it like that. It's just the whole thing is obviously this connected field, and everyone's got their own interpretation of it. Even at this level, it's so crazy. So I mentioned this before, but there's an amazing channel, a dyslexic artist take on the theory of everything, and you see dyslexic artist, and I really should know his name, but I think is it Andy or something? I'll have to find it. But dyslexic artist comments on Alexander Unziker's videos, on Real Physics videos, and he's actually trying to have this dialogue about the frame of reference idea that I've talked about on the channel, but really basically that at every single level, every scale, from the atomic scale, like the nucleus to the human to a planet to a solar system, experiences its own frame of reference. And as it's experiencing the ether, it's creating layers of plasma that store information and create a new layer of information. And that new layer of information has gravity, time, space, dimension, all of it at that scale, which explains to me the variableness of the constants that we think are constant. At every scale, they actually gradiate. So there's a diminishment and an expansion contraction of every single force that we know. It's just what scale are we experiencing it at, and the crossover between those two. Yeah, so I'm going to be refining the ideas a little bit more. I know I'm just like rambling like a crazy person here, but I love it. I'm excited. New stuff is always amazing. And let's play some music here. And I'll stretch a bit. Hopefully, if it's clear, I'll try and see if we can check out some Saturn before I call it a night.
I can feel like waves. I can feel. stay on far beyond this release, beyond this release. I believe in you. Sometimes I believe in silence. You got time to believe in me. Only get this life. A smile come away to my rhythm. Oh, slide. Alright, hopping back in here for the last little leg. I guess it got super cloudy, unfortunately, and our moon has set. But let me answer some questions. I'll hang out a little bit longer here. Patrick says, I totally dig what you're saying, and part of me says that totally makes sense, but it's difficult to think our Earth was once a star. Again, I need to research that more. And then Mary says, aren't stars fire? So, not fire in the way that we see fire here on Earth, right? So it's not like flames on a campfire. And again, the sun, right, is also convection. It's not really fire either. It's almost like liquid molten matter that is nested hexagons and pentagons. It's nested geometry, and you can see it's basically like outlining nested hexagons. And of course they're being stretched and pulled, and you have counter rotation, so the sun is still forming and also losing its atmosphere, and so the sun is cooling, which is really interesting. So I don't expect, from this video at all, people to go and be like, yeah, this is totally the way it works, but I think it's one of the best ideas I've heard, and really it's one of the best ideas I've heard about this. Especially when you look up popular mainstream ideas about planetary formation, and you look up Thunderbolts Project talking about planetary and star formation, no one's exactly sure how it works. So this idea that he's proposing is really, like I said, holistic, which it's just fully circular. You can actually really imagine it once you see the visualization and the way he talks about it. So I've spent at least 100 hours or more over the past couple of weeks just really digging into it and just listening to it in the background and just hearing all the different talks. And of course, you're going to notice some of these character traits about him that you might not vibe with. There are certain things that he says that I'm not 100% sure about, or I don't agree with almost at all. But in terms of just this cycle of two crossing wires in very simplistic terms. Here, let me actually sketch it real quick. I see Ghosted Collective, what's going on? I appreciate that. I've been talking a lot tonight. I'll end with a couple of songs. I know that I've just been rambling, but I'm pretty excited by this discovery. I see Mike Khan, what's going on, 24/7. What is that FPV? I don't know what that is. Fusion, right? So let me sketch this real quick. And of course, I know I'm gonna probably make some mistakes, but let's say we have filaments in space. Right here this is what Markland Convection is. So almost like twisting, tightening of the Birkeland filaments. I know what I was going to say earlier about protein folding. I don't know if anybody has looked into protein folding, this 50-year-old idea that we can use artificial intelligence or simulations to understand how proteins fold. And proteins are chains of amino acids, if you remember. Usually about 20 amino acids. And these amino acids connect, they self-arrange, and then they fold into this. Nope, that's not what they fold into. They fold into... Nope, not that either. They fold into that, into a hexagon. And so if you look at these up close, you'll see that these are actually these. And so proteins in our body actually follow the same, and it makes sense holistically that proteins would actually be wound up or created along filamentary guided axes or torsion effects of spiraling Birkeland currents. So not only do they fold into hexagons, this is also what a plasma kink a plasma kink instability looks like. So it also looks like your intestine. And self-arrangement into self-folding means that whatever this object is, it has spatial awareness, which is what I was talking about in terms of how everything is conscious. There's this idea that no, humans are conscious and there are certain things that aren't conscious. But I really think that everything that is actually visible to us is likely conscious, because in order for it to exist, for us to see it or experience it, it has to assemble. And it assembles in these patterns. So let me just jump back here in terms of the stellar evolution thing. I'll get back to that at another show. I want to do a whole thing about protein folding and how it's exactly Markland convection. But, okay, so at this very node, this essentially is a plasmoid or a Z-pinch. And what happens is this Z-pinch goes absolutely crazy and turns into a giant white star. And this is how I understand it. So since it has a Birkeland filament through it, it's still, this little node creates, I don't want to say it creates the Birkeland filament. Essentially every single node has a continued cable or a rope or a Birkeland filament going through the center of it. Absolutely every atom, hydrogen atom has a Birkeland filament going through it, and an electron has a Birkeland filament going through it, and a person has a Birkeland filament, and a planet has a Birkeland filament. I mean, you can call it a bunch of other things like coaxial electrical cable, magnetic ropes. Anyway, so big white star spinning extremely fast. The spin is crazy. Angular momentum is massive. So over time, and this is the Jeff Walensky Stellar Metamorphosis stuff. This is not me. I didn't discover this. I only discovered him discovering this. So white stars turn into smaller stars, blue giants. These blue giants are all the stars we see in the sky. So the spin is slower and it's losing atmosphere. But at the center, something is brewing. And then this ends up becoming smaller, I want to say red stars, orange stars, right? So it also follows color spectrum, it also follows wave patterns. So if you keep going with this, it ends up also becoming like a Fibonacci spiral. The whole thing is so
color coordinated and geometrically sound that this is why this idea is really cool. It makes a lot of sense. So let's say, just to save some space on the screen, so white to blue to red to yellow, our sun, condensed matter, granules, and then our sun turns into something like a big Jupiter, a brown dwarf, red storm, so tightening the convective bands, creating more and more, like basically compressing matter, but also losing atmosphere. So it's getting smaller in terms of a planetary body, but getting much more complex on the surface. So let's go all the way around. So Jupiter is what we see in the sky right now. Let's say Jupiter, this is my addition to it, Jupiter loses its outer atmosphere in a massive calamity, turns into a Saturn. And then Saturn ultimately will lose its rings due to the fact that the dissipation of what the rings are made of will essentially be gobbled up by space and turn into smaller and smaller fragments. Ultimately, you won't really see them anymore. And then Saturn is smaller and also has now formed a much harder core center. So if you keep going with it, ends up being a water world like Uranus or Neptune. Just now, tons of oceans, primitive life emergent from the star, which is really a brilliant way of looking at it. Nobody really has an understanding of how life came to be and why it would happen on Earth, and this actually explains it in a very fundamental way. So we end up Uranus, water world, and then let's fast forward, we get Earth, which is a combination of water world and inner mantle. And the mantle has been grown for whatever, hundreds of millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years or whatever, depending. That's really this whole idea of time and how we measure time is a whole other show. But let's just finish up this. So the mantle that we're actually living on right now on Earth was grown inside a star. This was and so over time it's also lost its spin. And so when we get to Earth, there's a really even spin because we're still along a Birkeland filament, but our spin is lessened. This also explains why if the moon was an old Earth, the moon is tidally locked at this point. The moon doesn't really spin, it only wobbles. So Earth ends up becoming a moon, ends up becoming Mercury, smaller and smaller, ultimately basically a metallic marble at the very end of it. Mercury almost doesn't spin at all. I would say probably, he says Mars and Venus are here too. This is interesting because it actually flies in the face of Velikovsky's idea that Venus is young. This is saying that Venus is actually way older than Earth and uninhabitable, basically a wasteland. And Venus ultimately becomes the moon. Sorry, yeah, Venus, the moon, Mercury, I would say Ceres, right? And then finally, his proposition here is that things start colliding with one another and creating debris. And the debris turns into Oumuamua and Comet 27P and on Hubble and all the comets and asteroids that have been photographed or landed on or so on and so forth. And they come basically from desiccated stratified rock or nickel, and that's why they have the same composite as moons and Mars. It's really brilliant. I mean, this idea is geometrically sound, it's sacredly sound, it's electrically sound. Really smart. I see Genghis Khan, what's going on? Exactly, DNA lightning. Excuse me. And then, yeah, so this is where, like when he was talking about things smashing into each other, turning into asteroids, is where I think maybe this is where electrical arcing happens. That's why things get excavated, because what we don't see is planets or moons that are half with chunks out of them. We only see basically perfectly spheroidal objects or chunks of cliff, like asteroids or comets. So I wonder if at this point, instead of them colliding with one another, you'd actually get galactic lightning bolts, creating arcing blasts and shooting out bits of material. To finish this up, so these bits of material, the debris, ultimately get gobbled up back by the giant stars, because these stars are spinning really rapidly and consuming all the matter. So there's a nice recycling part of this where ultimately stardust gets reabsorbed into larger stars and feeds the core, and then we're back in the cycle. And then Markland Convection is something that, if you look this up, Electric Universe talks about it, NASA talks about it. This is definitely a known theory, and this is where we have the apple core, the hypotrochoid, the pinched plasma tube, and the torus. The holographic fractal. This is Buddy James's system too, where you have the fractal recursion of this fundamental geometry. So, yeah, I dig it. I mean, and he also talks about a bunch of other stuff like rain and how rain might form. He talks about dinosaurs, which is another hugely amazing concept about how, let's see, what was he saying? He was saying, I think atmospheric pressure is measured in bars, if I'm not mistaken, and that his proposition, and Thunderbolts, Peter Mungo Jupp has talked about this on Thunderbolts Project, where they talk about how dinosaurs had to have a different type of Earth or atmosphere or composition of Earth in order to exist, and in the sense, like all gigantism needed a different type of Earth. And that's a very interesting idea, and, you know, to ponder, but it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So I hope I did the Stellar Metamorphosis thing justice for the first time, but like I will get better at explaining it. And this, combined with a bunch of other stuff recently, has filled in so many gaps in terms of Electric Universe principles, and it just, I like ideas that have this recycling mechanism to them. It's this idea of, you know, life and death, dark and light, sound, silence. Things are cyclical, and they move in wave patterns, in oscillations. And before, yeah, so I'm going to start streaming this moon cycle as long as the weather is clement, and I want to talk about consciousness again, like this idea of self and other, nucleus and shell, variable speed of light that Alexander Unziker is talking about, and then more about the stellar metamorphosis idea. Cool. So I'm not going to overdo it first night back, but hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your night. I'll catch you in the next couple. Please share and leave me comments, and or just go research this stuff and have some fun, because it's really interesting. And yeah, give the guys some love. Let's see. Ghosted Collective says, I try not to let the opinions of overly opinionated, because the habit of following sometimes due to their biased fears of containment of facts that no one real can confirm. If I'm garnering that correctly, I think it's good to, in a positive way, it's good to just be able to hear things and not have to completely change your mindset or react emotionally to new ideas. You can believe what you want to believe, and similarly, when people approach you with new ideas, unless you're just really bored and you want to go do something else, there's pretty much no reason to belittle or insult anyone over their core beliefs. Even people who believe in something you completely don't believe in, as long as they're not being aggressive or rude or mean, there's pretty much no reason to insult someone for what they believe, because maybe that's what makes them feel good. So I hope I don't insult anyone about religion or anything like that. For me, this is just about putting together a big puzzle, and this piece of it today is like, I've been excited to share it with y'all. Yeah, giant trees, giant animals, maybe human giants, right? That's where we get some of the early giants, and maybe the period was very short. Or maybe it was a short period followed by a long period of you know, actually what seems the case is that it just, we have these proportions, these linear proportions, these curved proportions, the inverse proportions. So as things get bigger, things get smaller. As things move away, things get lesser,
And sometimes it's the opposite. Like at the core of the Markland Convection, maybe it's actually cooler, and as you move away from the center of that Markland, that Z-pinch, it gets hotter, which would explain why the sun actually seems hot at the chromosphere rather than through the sunspots. So I've been able to really put together a few really interesting derivations from studying this stuff recently. Donald Yates says, does everything have the same Birkeland current? I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's like the idea is that it's a closed system. So absolutely everything in the universe is connected to everything else. So I would just imagine that it's scalar. It's just the same Birkeland filament, but the hairs on it are much smaller. The same way, like, if you would imagine that humans are tiny hairs on the surface of Earth, or trees are, and the same way we have hairs on our body. So I think we outline the filamentary Birkeland filaments that emerge, that connect Earth to space, and I think the hairs on our body outline the Birkeland filaments that connect our bodies to space. That's why things grow out at normal degrees from the surface. So every hair, the patterns are inescapable in terms of fractal recursion. That's how I see it, at least. All right, Space Fam, wonderful to see everybody. I'll shout you all out. Donald Yates, Ghosted, Patrick McNellis, Mary, Barry, great to see you. Always wonderful. I know I saw Shockwave earlier. Mike Kahn, I'll check out FPV Angel. Astralis, Red Rum, Plain Truth, Debbie Carson, Bryce Eshelman, Roach Steve, and Esoteric Gold. And if I missed you, I still appreciate you. I will see y'all really soon, and what was it? If you're catching this tomorrow, hope you're having an awesome day. This is your captain signing off on another space stream. Oh yeah, sorry about that. Fake out. I see Patrick McNellis has a question that I missed, so sorry about that. Not gonna miss it. I don't really have anywhere to go. I just don't want to do too long of a show tonight, but let's see. My first question is, why are there not more planets then? And what is the star to planet ratio in our visible universe? So in simple terms, the simple answer is he actually talks about this, Jeffrey does, in a couple of videos, and he goes deep into it. And then I started kind of looking up into like this idea of what's habitable planets, Earth-like planets, exoplanet research, Drake's equation. If you go down that rabbit hole, you start to see these kind of statistical ratios of like habitable planets versus not Earth-like planets and so on. Jeffrey's idea is that there are tons of Earths, and to me it seems like that's much more logical. That means there's a ton of tons of Earths, tons of Jupiters, tons of life, like probably humans. I mean, see, like I'm kind of just against the idea that the UFOs that we see are from other systems simply because they could be our own machines. But the idea that humans or life occurs on other planets is like absolutely logical in terms of the grander scheme of things. So I would imagine that there are a lot of Earths, and I think if you would imagine that life has some sort of cosmic understanding of itself, then life is at different stages of variation, evolution. So there are probably versions of us, and there are probably more advanced civilizations. I haven't really changed my tune on that. I just always try and like reaffirm the idea of ufology in terms of a concept. I've really moved towards it's our machines and our research. But can there be life on other planets? I really think, yeah, it's likely life emerges from the complexity of the electrochemical fusion, and really it's the convection that's happening, and that's a whole other show, but that's my thought. Hells yeah, everybody. Is there anything else? Does everything that, yeah, got that. Tickle tickle. Yeah, I'm actually so like relieved now, because I've been like, holy shit, I gotta share this idea with, like, this concept and this channel with my TBS fam. So I'm feeling pretty relieved right now. Now I can rest easy and talk about it a bit more in detail. Ghosted says, everything you've touched on has probably happened in the physical, but our memories are taken with each reincarnation of the spirit by the flesh. And yeah, there's a whole thing about the fact that memory of past life is stored in the so-called Akashic record, or in the field, but personal aperture or frame of reference of each life that we get, that we incarnate into, so to speak, gets a reset on the viewpoint, right? The point of view gets reset, but we come from, or we exist within, a conscious record of things. Hells yeah. Alright, everybody. Is there a little song I can play to take us out here? There must be, right? Alright, good night, y'all. Much love. Captain, see you soon.